All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Real quick, before we get started, we're going to do a couple introductions real fast. My name is Nate Marufo. I'm a senior technical consulting engineer for the Cisco Duo product. Coming up this Friday, I'm celebrating my 3-year at Cisco, so I'm extremely excited that it gets to happen at Live, which is super cool.
Hi everyone, my name is Kitsia Gonzalez. I've been a technical consulting engineer at Cisco for 1.5 years now. A quick fun fact about myself, actually, before my journey here. I have experience with Duo at my university as a user and also as a help desk admin, so super excited to be presenting this to you all today. A quick fun fact about both of us: over our combined time at Cisco Duo, we've resolved about 7,000 cases combined, and we both have a 90% overall customer satisfaction.
Awesome. Well, obviously, as you can tell here, we're going to be talking about unlocking seamless authentication with Duo SSO, MFA, and SAML.
All right, so a quick agenda of what we'll be covering today. We're going to start off with giving an overview of single sign-on and SAML, and that's going to lead us right into Duo single sign-on. And also we're going to cover some authentication sources that you can leverage with Duo single sign-on. And then we're also going to touch on why Duo SSO and the benefits of using it in your environment. And then we're going to wrap up with some troubleshooting scenarios that you may come across, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end.
Awesome. So we've already said the words 1 million times already at this point. What is single sign-on? What is SSO? Well, the idea of single sign-on is simplicity. Whether or not you think you've used single sign-on in the past, you probably have in more places than you'd expect. Think about when you're logging into an app on your phone, you see the login with Google or login with Apple buttons. That is an idea of single sign-on. The idea is simplicity for a single user to log in with a single set of credentials into all of their web-protected applications. A couple quick definitions about SSO. So things that we're going to cover quite a few times today is identity providers and service providers, also abbreviated as IDP and SPs. Identity providers are the source of authentication for a user, where we're storing credentials, we're storing attributes about the user. Think of places like Active Directory or Entra ID, things like that. On the service provider side, this is the application that you're actually protecting with SSO. So think of things like logging into a Meraki VPN or Salesforce as an example.
All right, so we covered single sign-on, we got some nice definitions, but before we can dive into Duo single sign-on, we have to cover an important part of SSO, which is SAML. So SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, and you can think of it as the glue that holds together SSO. And as Nate mentioned, you know, that button, login with Google, login with Apple ID, SAML is what's working in the background. It's doing the magic for your users' login experience. So before SAML came along, your users had multiple usernames, passwords for all their applications, and it was frustrating. That's where password fatigue came in, and then SAML comes along into the equation, and now your user logs into an application, and what happens is that service provider, your application, gets redirected to your identity provider, and it creates a SAML assertion, which is a message that is sent between your IDP and SP to form that trusted relationship between both your SP and IDP. And we did want to note there is another communication standard, OIDC and OAuth. We're not going to focus on it for this presentation, but it is an option as well. All right, so now that leads us into Duo single sign-on. So where is Duo involved in SSO? So this is actually a nice little diagram directly from our Duo SSO documentation. And as you can see, Duo SSO is the middleman. On the left, we have our service providers, our applications that your users are wanting to log into. And on the right-hand side, we have those identity providers, whether it's AD or SAML IDP. And so involving Duo into your SSO workflow, essentially what you're doing is adding an extra layer of security. You're adding MFA into your SAML workflow, and that's really the purpose of involving Duo single sign-on, is getting that extra layer of security and just really securing your users when they're using SAML in your organization.
So as we saw in that previous diagram there, we had the options of multiple authentication sources with Duo SSO. We support both Active Directory lookups as well as SAML identity providers. So we're going to talk about the actual flow of those authentications. This is also a great diagram we keep in our documentation. What we're looking at is the flow from a user logging in from the Active Directory perspective and getting passed back into the service provider. Users first accessing the web applications page. They're entering their credentials, which are being passed down to the authentication proxy service, which we'll talk about in a second. Once that authentication completes an AD, we're then sending the user an MFA request. Once they complete that MFA request, we're then passing them back onto the application. Quick note, if you're familiar with Duo already, this authentication proxy is also probably pretty familiar to you. It is a flexible, lightweight proxy service that you can run in your environment. We are using it specifically for the AD lookups for a user. We're taking that request that's being entered from the user on that cloud login prompt. We're sending that down to the proxy. The proxy is binding against Active Directory to complete that request. And if you're familiar with the proxy already and you have one in your environment, deploying this setup is literally 4 lines of code. It is that simple to get this set up and deployed. On the SAML identity provider, the flow side of the things, the flow is actually pretty much the same thing. Instead of looking against Active Directory, we're looking against that SAML identity provider instead. So same flow architecture will pop up, users logging into the service provider page, they're being redirected to the identity providers page. So let's say Entra as an example, they're seeing an Entra prompt, they're entering their credentials there. Once they complete that authentication, we're passing them back over to the SSO side, sending them an MFA request, getting them then redirected back to the application in question. Now, how would you choose one authentication source versus the other? On the right here, you'll see this is exactly what it looks like when you're logging into the admin panel and configuring this for the first time. We have a couple of benefits to each side of the equation, though. Active Directory, as we mentioned, the authentication proxy is a lightweight service that you're probably already leveraging if you use Duo at this time. So super easy to set up and deploy. Passwordless is a super cool function of SSO where we can apply MFA to a user and with a more high step up style of MFA factor. Think of like roaming authenticators like YubiKeys or platform authentication like Face ID or Touch ID. When those more secure factors are used, we can have the option of not prompting the user to enter password every time they go to log in. Super fun. We also support password resets through AD. We'll talk about this a little bit later using LDAP-S. We have multi-domain support, so if you have a complicated AD environment, we also have that functionality built in. It'll work just as expected. And then also the big elephant in the room is Microsoft 365. We know a lot of people are protecting Microsoft applications in their environment, and using AD is a requirement for those setups. We'll also talk about that a little bit later. On the SAML IDP side, the first thing is obviously if you're using a SAML IDP already, you probably don't want on-premise servers to begin with. And we don't require any additional servers or any services to be running in your environment to get that setup working. And then finally, if your users are familiar with the prompts that they see, let's say from Entra or whoever it may be as your identity provider, they're seeing that same login prompt just with the MFA requirement after that step. So it's one less thing for them to complain about being new and different.
All right, so that leads us into why should you use Duo SSO? Maybe you're already utilizing SAML and it's working, but why add Duo into that equation? So we want to talk briefly a bit about the benefits to Duo SSO. And so utilizing Duo SSO, bringing it into your SSO workflow, well, first of all, I do want to note it's available on all Duo editions, so you're free to test it out anytime in your environment and see how that works. The main thing, and you'll see it throughout this entire presentation, is just the user-friendly experience of it. I mean, you'll even see in the errors coming up in our troubleshooting section just how nice they are for your users to see. And of course, Duo is first and foremost MFA. So really what you get is our strong MFA that comes with Duo, and also we have an extensive policy management as well, so you also get that as well. Now for Duo Single Sign-On, we do have what's called named and generic integrations. So we do have an extensive list of service providers that we have official documentation for to integrate with Duo Single Sign-On. However, if you find an application that's not listed in our named integrations that we support, you can use our generic SAML integration, which works with any application that supports SAML 2.0. All right, and so Duo has a lot of features included, but there are features just exclusive to Duo Single Sign-On, and a few of them are listed here. We mainly want to highlight Duo Desktop, which checks your user's device health. and depending on how it's doing, it'll either deny them or approve them, depending on how you have that configured in your environment. And we did want to talk about Duo Central, Nate and I's favorite Duo single sign-on feature. Have a screenshot here. As you can see, it's just a dashboard with tiles of other applications that may be Duo protected as well, or maybe just other websites that you need your users to access. And the cool thing is you really see SSO at work, because Duo Central, you log in with SSO, and if these applications are also protected with SSO, your user's already logged in. So that's Duo SSO at work right there. All right, and we wanted to highlight a new feature also available with Duo SSO, and that's Duo Passport, recently announced at RSA, and this actually leverages Duo Desktop as well with Duo for Windows Login and RDP, and it utilizes the Remember Me function, which has never been seen before. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to see us at our booth or after the presentation. And that leads us into troubleshooting.
Awesome. So when we're troubleshooting SSO, there are a couple of really important things that you should look for before you actually, really dive in. The first is our favorite, the authentication proxy we've mentioned a bunch of times already. The logs that are generated for this are super helpful, because obviously we're binding against Active Directory in a way that's not kind of standard. So the logs that are generated here provide a lot of context as to what could potentially be wrong if we're looking for a user and for some reason we're not finding them, etc. Next is, when we talked about that password reset functionality, that requires LDAP-S configurations to protect the connection between your proxy and your domain controllers. Well, that requires certificates, everybody's favorite. And we have a tool for validating your actual certificate chain. We'll talk about this in a little bit more depth later. It's called ACERT. These next two, HAR captures as well as SAML traces, these are both browser-based plugins that are checking both the connectivity that's happening between your different parts of that SAML workflow, as well as what's included in those SAML assertions that are being passed back and forth between identity and service providers. When we're configuring generic integrations like Kitsia mentioned earlier, it's very important that we have access to the SAML service provider's documentation, because we don't know, on the Duo side of things, how to configure for what they're looking for. Their documentation is going to tell us exactly what we need to make sure that everything's functioning as possible. Same thing goes for their logs. If we're passing through an assertion with an expected value that should be working, we want to make sure that something else might not be afoot, and that's where their logs would come in. Finally, we mentioned briefly OIDC and OAuth. OIDC Playground is a great tool to help troubleshoot those kinds of integrations. Like we said, we're not talking about it hugely in depth today, but come talk to us if you have questions about it afterwards. This leads us into identity provider errors.
All right, so we're going to start off with invalid SAML response. As you may recall, I mentioned that SAML assertion that's created and that is sent between your IDP and SP. And so if you ever see this error, essentially what it means is that that SAML response that was received by your service provider was, first and foremost, it may have been in an incorrect format. And in this case, what you want to double check is to make sure that your identity provider does support SAML 2.0, because if not, this might be the error that you experience. And another thing as well, that SAML assertion that's created, it has a lot of information from the user's login. And that includes the time of login, because after a certain amount of time as well, that assertion can become invalid. So another thing to check would be your internal authentication server's clock to make sure that's not causing any issues with that SAML assertion that's being sent to your SP. And lastly, as you can see, it says invalid SAML response. Well, when you create an SSO, a Duo SSO application in your admin panel, there's actually a section titled SAML response. And that's it's not a mistake. And the main part that you're going to want to focus to resolve this error is the name ID format. Now, this is essentially the username, the name ID that's being sent to your service provider, and it will mostly always be email address as shown here, unless otherwise specified by your service provider. So if you're getting this error and you notice that it's not email address, make that switch and it should resolve your issue. All right, invalid credentials, one of my favorites. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of error. Might not be Duo specific or Cisco. I know I got one, I believe, this morning. But in that case, I actually was putting my incorrect password. I didn't type it in properly. So that brings us into troubleshooting. The first thing you're going to want to check is your username and your password, of course. And if that's not working, reset your password. And then if you're still having issues, then we'll continue with troubleshooting, right? All right, so the first thing, we're going to focus on AD specifically for this error, and I have a test user account here. So the main thing that we're going to want to check whenever we have an invalid credentials error is to make sure that there's no restrictions on that user's account in AD. And also make sure that any unique attributes that you need to send over to Duo or that they need to be able to log into their service provider, that they're not missing these attributes. And something that you'll notice that is essential to single sign-on is an email domain and email in general. So as you can see here in this AD account, this user, test user, is missing the mail attribute. And so because the mail attribute is missing, they're going to receive the invalid credentials error, and that is the cause. So once you add in that mail attribute, they should be set and they'll no longer receive invalid credentials. Another thing you want to make sure is to make sure that your email domain has been verified in Duo SSO. When configuring Duo SSO, you add your email domain and you verify that you do have ownership of it. So this can also affect your user able to log in. And if you do take a look at our troubleshooting tools, what you'll notice in the off proxy log is you'll have an error stating that the user could not be found. And what this means is that you'll need to go into AD and find what's wrong and why the user isn't being found from AD.
Awesome. Another Active Directory specific error that you can find is ambiguous search results. So this is actually resulting from us looking into your primary AD, whether it be a multi-forest domain or a single domain setup, and we're finding more than one example of the attribute that the user is actually entering. So we talked about email address. It's the most important thing in this SSO deployment. We're making sure that there are no duplicate users, but also no users sharing that same value that's being split across. So it's just ensuring that all those things are set in the proper places, unique email addresses overall, and like we mentioned, if we're checking in Active Directory users and computers, you can take a look and do the search lookup feature to make sure that that attribute is actually unique. Other Active Directory related errors that we'll see, IDP query failure. This can mean quite a few ones actually. So my favorite thing to check first is to actually make sure that that authentication proxy service is actually running. Even though it's lightweight, sometimes we can see that maybe the machine, the server in question has a restart, maybe the proxy service didn't start again on its own. We want to make sure that it's actually up and running. When we're configuring SSO as well, we're running a special command on that server that the proxy is present on, and we're making sure that it's ready for the SSO authentication request that will be sent down from our cloud service, and then can pass that along to AD. We also, as we've mentioned a million times, email address attributes are extremely important here, so we need to make sure that those are set properly as well. Finally, we need to make sure that the user is actually in that source directory. When you're configuring that within the actual admin panel itself, you're setting a base distinguished name, what we're searching users under in your domain. And if the user exists above that directory, that level, then we're obviously also not going to be able to find them. Finally, also the incorrect port error that could come along with this. We mentioned LDAP-S, so you can configure LDAP-S but still have your port set to 389. Obviously it should be 636 in comparison, so that's a good thing to check as well. We'll talk about that again in a second here. The actual error that you could see for that user in the directory or being missing from the directory, this invalid LDAP filtering error, that basically is meaning, hey, we're looking under that specific base DN that we've specified and we can't find the user because of it. Usually at that point, we just recommend setting it to the top level of the domain to resolve. Certificates, everybody's favorite thing in the world. With LDAP-S protection, we offer the ability for not only that password reset functionality, but some of the features of passwordless are enabled with it as well. When we're doing the initial setup of SSO with the proxy, we actually have you perform tests from the admin panel to make sure that we can actually contact the target domain and perform an LDAP bind. What's nice about this internal tool that we've built called ACERT is you can actually perform a bind against AD directly, and it will output the full certificate chain that you can directly copy and paste into your admin panel to make sure that we have that proper flow configured. You can see an example of what the certificate chain would look like on the right here. Love this tool. It is a fantastic problem solver.
All right, so we've covered identity provider errors, so now that leads us into service provider errors. And before we dive into that, we need to bring up metadata. So whenever you create it's a little different for generic and named integrations. For a named integration, you'll get an XML file that you can download that has all the necessary metadata that you need to provide to your service provider. For a generic SAML integration, it'll be at the very top in your admin panel for that application. And as you can see, it's mainly URLs. There's also stuff for certificates, but we'll mainly focus on the URLs for this presentation. And what this metadata is, it's information that you're providing to your service provider to form that trusted relationship with Duo single sign-on.
And one of the first service provider errors that we can see is actually related to that first bit of metadata that was listed on that last slide, which is entity IDs. The idea of an entity ID is the description or name of that specific service provider or identity provider. They both have their own independent value, and the opposite one, so let's say service provider needs to know about your identity provider, and your identity provider needs to know about your service provider. The entity IDs need to match. If you don't have them matching, you'll receive an error similar to this. The first thing is to make sure that those entity IDs have been copied directly. We actually even provide you a really nice copy button from the admin panel that you can just directly copy it over. In a second here, you'll see a screenshot of what this looks like. It's right at the top of your admin panel page, like Kitsy had mentioned in that previous slide.
So as you saw, there was a lot of URLs in that metadata, and so we have this is a general slide for URL mismatching for any of those. This one is particular to the ACS URL. As you can see, the error states that it did not match what was configured in your service provider. So really, whenever you get any errors that state that there was a URL mismatch, there's not much troubleshooting beyond double checking that those URLs are correct. It sounds cumbersome, but even a white space, a period that's not supposed to be there, it'll break your integration. So, and another thing to note is that each SSO application in your admin panel has a unique single sign-on URL, and it was also listed in the metadata, the sign-in URL. So just make sure that your URLs are correct. So in this case, you want to make sure that your ACS URL is correct, and that should resolve your issue.
So, as we mentioned earlier, it's important to have your SAML service provider's documentation in the event that you're setting up a generic integration, specifically because there's certain values that might be, or certain attributes that need to be passed through that are not normalized. This error that you can get because of these attributes mismatching is actually the first error you'll see outside of the MFA workflow. So let's say the user has fully passed MFA and then they come across an issue like this. This tool built, users logging in, and somehow we're missing the email address. But let's say we have the name ID set as appropriately as we expected earlier, and we're still getting this error. Well, what's cool about Duo SSO is that certain service providers may ask for these attributes in really weird ways, whether it be because of capitalization or because they use a different format of this attribute value that's not, the standard for everybody. Duo SSO has the functionality to be able to create, map, or just completely make your own attributes that can be passed through hard-coded in each response. As an example here, this is what the mapping of attributes would look like. In the example, the department field and manager field, they use a capitalization on the first letter when the SAML service provider is looking for that response. Or in AD, it's actually just that lowercase value. And the final one, they also want an office location attribute passed back through SAML. And from AD, we're going to grab that physical delivery office name value. We're passing that along through in the format that built is looking for. Next, obviously, we're going back to Microsoft 365. We know, like we mentioned, a lot of people are integrating this with Duo SSO, so it's very important to touch on. We mentioned that AD is a requirement for these kinds of deployments. Well, this is because of how this source anchor works. Well, we're using AD as the auth source for it. We're going to grab a specific value that links this source anchor attribute to link this with your Entra ID user as well, to form a relationship to understand which actual panel or application that they're trying to gain access to, the profile in the cloud. The source anchor is how that's configured. This uses the Azure AD Connect tool, or now Entra Connect, to actually sync this value through. It should have, there we go, perfect. This is what that tool looks like when you're specifying it. The default behavior for this is using MSDS consistency GUID. You can actually specify different values as well. So if you've actually configured this in the past with a different value, we have the ability to set it in our admin panel too. But we generally do recommend using the default of MSDS consistency. In the event that this is not set correctly, we can come across a name ID error. When we go to log in as that user, we'll run across that we cannot find the source attribute on that user when they go to log in. What that means is it's possible that the user was created after that last Azure sync took place. So at that moment, we don't have a value set for them, and we have no way to associate that on-prem user with that Entra ID user. Solution obviously is to make sure that actually the attribute has been set, and that we would want to run a sync more recently to make sure that it's actually connected and associated properly.
All right, so one last important thing that we need to bring up regarding Microsoft is legacy clients. So this is directly from Microsoft themselves, and many of you are probably familiar with the right-hand side because that's what we use today anytime we log into any Microsoft protected application. The left-hand side is what we refer to as legacy authentication. Different UI, I'm sure many of you have seen it before. Microsoft is moving away from legacy authentication due to security reasons. So that is why we have this slide, because how does this impact your organization? So we have this amazing feature in Duo single sign-on applications, and it's called WS Trust. And what this does is, because there are still so many organizations that leverage legacy clients, we want to make sure that they can still use Duo to be protected. And so that's where WS Trust comes in. So typically this is for those organizations that have Entra ID join machines, scan functions, printers as well, that still use legacy authentication. And so this section here, WS Trust configuration, you'll see that in your SSO configuration in the admin panel, and you'll simply just need to enable that so that your users can leverage and still use legacy authentication with Duo as well. And you also have some granular controls based on IPs and also groups, so you can restrict the users that can still leverage legacy authentication. All right, so now time to wrap it up. So we discussed a lot. That was a lot of information. The main thing we wanted to highlight is you guys learned how Duo SSO is injected into your SSO workflow, like this diagram right here. And we talked about single sign-on and SAML, and then tied it all together into Duo single sign-on.
We also talked about how to choose an authentication source based on your specific environment. We talked about how Duo adds that powerful MFA that you know and trust from other Duo integrations in your environment to this SSO workflow. And then we discussed how to troubleshoot some of those identity provider, service provider, and specifically Microsoft 365 errors that may occur. We really appreciate you joining us today. As you're probably aware, these sessions have the ability to be evaluated through a survey after your session is over. Not only is that really cool and reflects for us, but also you can earn points for this and get some cool prizes from it too. So if you get the chance to complete the survey, we really, really appreciate it.
Also, our presentation deck will be available to you afterwards, and we do have a slide with amazing documentation for SSO and also for generic named integrations, Microsoft 365. We also have a beer drinker's guide to SAML. Strange name, it's a blog post. If you want more information on SAML, it's an amazing read, so definitely check it out. And also, because of this presentation, we were able to make an internal-only article public-facing for you all, and it includes the errors that we discussed today and additional errors that we did not have time for, so make sure to check it out, Article 6122. And if you have any questions for us after the presentation or later on, feel free to reach out to us at support@duo.com and just mention Cisco Live and Kitsia and Nate.
Awesome. For that, we open it up to question and answers. We only have a little bit of time left, but hopefully we can squeeze some in if you've got them. All right. Passwordless, yes.
How does that work with Windows 10, Windows 11?
Logging into the OS itself.
Yeah, just the general what does it take to implement?
So passwordless only functions specifically with our Duo universal prompt that you'll see. The actual prompt that's served for our Win Logon integration looks very similar to a Duo prompt, but it can't actually be a full-fledged web-based prompt because of limitations with Microsoft itself. So passwordless right now is not a feature with Windows Login. It's something potentially for the future, but as of this moment, not currently for the OS login itself. for the SSO side of things, at least, we're specifically looking at, we have a lot of policy configuration abilities where as long as you have one of those more secure factors, you're coming from a trusted machine. We don't have to serve that password prompt if it's something that you choose as an organization that you don't want to use. But then you can stack certain policies on top of it that if you do see that it's a slightly riskier authentication than it might, would have normally been, then we can step up that authentication, require password, and also a more secure factor on top. Hopefully that answers. Yeah. Anybody else?
Anything?
Is the dual passport included with the Advantage license, or has to be a separate license?
Passport. I can answer that afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't want to say for sure, but yes, we can talk about it.
Yeah. I want to say it is.
I think it is, but we'll verify afterwards.
We'll double check. It's still a new feature, so.
Yeah, launched at RSA. We're pretty excited about it. Question? Yeah.
When it comes to using service accounts with Active Directory, I know you have to be at the root DN
Sure.
to do that search out, but can you talk about the rights that account needs to have? Because there's a lot of times that can get broken.
Sure.
Or, does it just need read write or just read only to the entire directory? What sort of attributes?
Sure.
You have to adjust those based on what your model is. It's kind of,
So the question was surrounding using service accounts when we're trying to, perform any lookups for AD and the certain rights that need to be had for that specific service account. It's important to note that if we are, read-only is really the only thing that we have to have, but also the other rule is wherever that proxy server sits, we need to have log on to rights also configured for that service account on that specific machine. Other than that, it's free reign. It is really just read-only requirements. Hopefully that answers it. Yes, very much so. Great question. Anything else?
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Free.